All right, joined now by Dave Killen and Beth Nakamura from the Oregonian. And guys, we're here, as you know, to talk about the Oregonian and Oregonian lives 2020 year in pictures. And, we put together a sort of looking back at the year as we do every year. And I just said, man, RIP to the mental health of whatever producer has to put that together. Looking back over the storylines of this year is insane. I mean, I just want to point out, when you look at the headline photo, so to speak, it's one of Dave's, and it's that employee at Woodstock Spirits who's all masked up, and it's from mid-April. I mean, you think back to that time, we didn't really know a lot about what was happening with the virus, but then you kind of scroll down and you backtrack to January, and it's wild to look at what you all were covering at the time. I mean, this question is kind of to either of you, just off the top. Is it as insane for you to look back at what you were shooting and what we as journalists were covering pre-pandemic?
Yeah, it feels like it didn't happen this year. When you go back to January, it doesn't feel like that was 2020. It's hard to remember what happened in January. For me, it feels like long in the distance. I can remember the Jeremy Christian trial, which was in February, but that also just feels like that happened in it couldn't possibly have been this year. It was too long ago.
Yeah, Beth, what about you? I mean, did you remember it? Go ahead.
Yeah, the whole year, I would say, felt this sort of like time just became suspended. And it's like, what is it? March 59th, today? Or
right.
Just like a really, really, like our whole concept of time was just shattered and in pieces on the floor, basically. I mean, that was just, I think it was like that for everyone. It was just sort of like an assault of news for all of us, really, not just here in Portland, but around the country. It was a big year for everyone, and it was a big year for journalism.
Definitely. I think, Beth, one of your photos, which shows someone in the window of a veteran's home who's looking over those who have been diagnosed. That's the first photo, I believe, or at least one of the first photos that is tied to COVID in the sequence. I'm just curious, again, for both of you, and Beth, I'll start with you. Like, what's the first story that you remember covering, or the first shoot that you went to where you realized, okay, so this is huge, and the world is changing. Things are different.
I think that was a slow creep, although I will say when I headed out to Lebanon to the veterans home there, it was, I would say, in stark relief, I think, meeting caregivers who were, at that point, it's incredible to think now, but at that point, Little Lebanon was a hotspot in the state of Oregon because of the veterans home there. And so that was the first time I was in direct physical contact with people who were providing care. And in fact, I think later, some of them got diagnosed themselves. The caregivers there were not able to go to their homes. They were holed up in little apartments that were, within yards of the veterans home. And it was very real to me then.
And Dave, what about you? Kind of same question. What's the first time that you remember realizing the enormity of this, maybe?
Sorry. It was actually the same place. I had a really brief assignment at that Lebanon veterans home. Very early on, I think it was maybe the day or the morning after we learned about the outbreak, and rushed down there and basically just got exterior photos of the buildings. It was totally locked down. We weren't, allowed in, couldn't talk to anybody. So I didn't have the interactive experience that Beth did, but that outbreak at that home, I think, was, when it again feels like a whole different time, but it's happening now. It's happening in Oregon. This is going to be, and sort of the very beginning of figuring out how are we going to deal with covering this with distancing and masks and things like that. So that was same thing for me. And then I suppose just something different than Beth, we did that portrait series, which wasn't until April. We actually worked on that. I think we might have started working on that very soon after the Lebanon outbreak. And I remember trying to figure out the logistics of that, how to shoot. We had, for a while, we were thinking, are we going to have to start shooting portraits with 300 millimeter lenses, and trying to figure out what at the time it was sort of everyone was figuring out like what businesses are going to be considered essential, what people's lives will change radically, and whose will actually not change that much in terms of work, and who should we be talking to about these portraits. And that was sort of the beginning.
How did you shoot the series?
The beginning.
Sorry.
Relatively, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure we all had, Beth, I don't know if it was any different for you. The ones that I ended up doing, we, other than keeping a decent amount of social distance, definitely more than 6 feet. I remember it being, trying to be like across the room or whatever, but I don't remember any extremes like standing across the street and using a 300 millimeter lens. I usually just left it up to people what they were comfortable with. But I did it over the course of the year, shoot a couple long distance portraits. That series.
We had to really rethink everything about how we do our jobs. As did you folks in TV. I would show up at places and see you with your long extenders on your mics, and we all had to sort of, we work in a part of journalism that really kind of demands an intimacy, and so we had, and so all of the little tools that we kind of rely on to achieve that, we had to reassess. And so, everything about the pandemic was the mind meld, and it was all sort of in slow motion, and somewhat through a looking glass, it felt like at the time. Like you're asking me this and I can't, like it's so deep in the recesses of my brain, it's hard to even access those early months. And I, look past at those pictures and I just, was that 2 decades ago or something?
Yeah, I think it's almost like a defense mechanism that we've all just kind of shoved it back into the recesses. Truly.
I've since actually read, there's research on that relates to trauma and the brain and how it affects our sense of time. And that is exactly right. It was sort of almost like a collective trauma that we were all experiencing that was affecting our relationship with time itself.
It's funny that you are not funny. Like Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say this idea that March never really ended.
Yeah.
It feels like a very communal, like everybody feels that way. So it's interesting, the relationship with time, that it expands and contracts based on your experiences.
Truly. I mean, Beth, you said like that there's a level of intimacy. I remember having talks with colleagues early on, and I said, I've never felt more like a therapist in my life or in my career. Like every single person that we shoot, every single person that we interview, everyone that we talk to, even on the phone, really wants that emotional connection more than I've ever seen before. I mean, you guys, I think especially when you are shooting somebody and there can be those moments where they're just relaxed and talking in between. I assume you guys felt that as well.
Oh, definitely. And I think, it became, there's so many ways in which, we have to quickly establish trust with people and with subjects, and that's kind of a warm muscle for us in this business. And that too became, I don't know, I want to say a challenge. It was more sort of like all I had were my eyes at that point, and they are such a powerful communicator and connector between people. But I lost all of the other kind of cues that we rely on, at least in terms of our face and facial muscles and all the kind of ways that things get communicated that we don't even think about. And so it really became more, about eye contact between people. And I would say, the social isolation, I mean, certainly, we were at the front lines of so much as essential workers and as people tasked with, trying to communicate the stories that were happening in our world with urgency to readers and viewers. It fell on us to sort of quickly figure out how to best achieve that. But even with that, we too were experiencing isolation. We were covering the story that we were also experiencing, and that was so unique about, and is so unique about the pandemic. And that's it, different.
How has people wearing masks changed how you shoot people, or has it? Like only being able to see their eyes as opposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in like portraiture situations, after having established enough distance and people's comfort with it, I would usually ask is it okay if you take off your mask? Are you comfortable taking off your mask? I'm, 15 feet away or whatever. So for that, yeah, I would definitely rather have people, if they're comfortable, remove or pull down the mask for a portrait. But in sort of breaking news type situations, it didn't really change too much, I guess. What do you think, Beth?
Yeah, I mean, I think with people who were in, state agencies or law enforcement and that sort of thing, I think that there was more of a mindfulness around what wearing the mask signaled individuals. But for the average person, it was a little bit like, should I wear this? Should I not? We were just sort of in this brave new world. And I think it always just came down to following the guidelines laid out by the CDC. And then at that point, it's sort of deferring to the subject, if we're in a portrait type situation, what they were comfortable doing and just deferring to that. It was all about that.
Yeah. How vital was it?
I guess usually, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was just thinking about it. I think usually I'm looking for people's eyes anyway, in terms of like how I'm trying to focus and what I'm looking for. So that may be why the masks didn't throw me. If your question was how did it change actually setting up and shooting a photo in a non-portraiture situation, it didn't change a whole lot to me because normally I'm looking for eyes anyway, and I could still see those.
Yeah. What your thoughts on sort of like how vital it was to include, maybe that's not the word that you would use, but shoots like the parking lot prom and like, drive-ins that people were having. And as people kind of started flexing their muscles a little bit, like knowing what they were comfortable with, and then here come these happy moments. And I just, there's always that balance in news of covering the dark versus covering things that are optimistic. But especially in this time, like what were your thoughts on how important those moments were to cover as well?
Oh, I think covering the rites of passage and just life as it unfolds for all of us became actually more important than ever because the news was so overwhelmingly, I don't want to say negative, but scary. But we're still alive and still experiencing, as with the pandemic prom, developmental milestones and phases and rites of passage. Kids were still having to go to school and graduate and try to carve out some normalcy within a situation that was completely abnormal. And so when I went to that prom, it was actually so much fun. It was just all girlfriends, and they had spent a lot of their spare time after school. They would hang out in the strip mall parking lot. And so they decided that together they would celebrate their prom in the strip mall parking lot. So I kind of felt like every minute I was there, I was sort of like in an episode of This American Life. Like it was so incredible. But you know what? They were so happy that we were there. They were like, they felt so seen in a time in their life where everything was around them had collapsed. And so the idea that the newspaper would show up and communicated to them that they were important, that this moment was important, that they were seen for who they were and what was really special to them meant the world to them. It almost was like, we've really experienced this now because the newspaper is here, and that they were so happy. And I was so happy to make them happy. Like, I felt like so much of what we did this year felt more than ever like a public service. And even in those little quieter, smaller moments that weren't necessarily newsy, I felt like I was providing a tremendous public service for people. And that was really satisfying. I mean, that really gave that sense of purpose, helped inoculate me, I think, and us against some of the, trauma that was happening collectively in our community and across the United States. When you have a sense of purpose and you know that what you're doing brings vital information to people and a mirror for who they are and what they're experiencing, then it helps you to get through it.
Right. So the world changed in March, and then the world changed in May. And here comes another massive, overwhelming, emotional storyline that you two, I think both of you, from what I remember, were almost, sort of embedded in more, or at least as much as any journalist in Portland. I mean, first, when we're talking, I'm talking about the protests in the wake of the death of George Floyd, you all were out there almost nightly. How much were you both out there, actually, to clarify?
We would often alternate, so it was rare that Beth and I were out the same night. So it was usually either me or Beth or Mark Graves, and then on big nights, or sometimes we were wrong. Sometimes there would be a night that we thought a lot was going to happen, so we would both go, and then we would not need both of us. But when I was going back through, sort of putting together the rough edit of all the photos from the protests, there were a handful of nights where Beth and I were both out there. But so not sure that really answers your question. But between the two of us, we were probably, I don't know, Beth, what, like 75% of the time,
At least,
one of the two of us?
Yeah. I mean, we were there, we were there enough to be really attuned to the rhythms of, what was happening on the ground, and to be able to kind of anticipate and sort of read the room of the protest ground between the two of us. And, collectively, we have a staff of other people. Sean Mager was a sports photographer. He had to pivot, as so many sports journalists did, into news. He did an amazing job with that. Mark Graves, Brooke Herbert, people who were kind of doing primarily other things that were also visual, really pivoted. And we really kind of coalesced as a team, although I'd say probably primarily it was me and Dave on the protest. But together we kind of saw each other through, what was a real cultural inflection point here in Portland, certainly, and around the country.
Yeah.
One
thing I always. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Oh, this isn't. Maybe I should wait for your next question, because it's sort of a. But I can also just talk if you want.
Yeah, no, I love people who just talk. Go for it.
One thing I always think about is that, and sort of to tie the two stories together, is that for the first night of the big protest, which was May 29th, there actually had been a small protest on the 28th. But what I always remember is walking into Peninsula Park on May 29th after having been hardly around anyone outside of my house, for a couple of months, and just walking into this large group of people, and most of whom were wearing masks. But it was an odd experience, just sort of having to be like, oh, I guess this is happening. Like this, I am no longer staying away from people. This is going to be different from what we've become accustomed to for a couple of months, and have to sort of be okay with that, and sort of recognize it and move on. Like, the being away from everybody is over now. Like, I'm going to now be amongst a huge crowd, at least for tonight. And, and at the time we didn't know that the protests were not a very significant spread of the virus. So we kind of had to, like, well, I don't know, maybe this means I'll get it, but
yeah,
that's okay.
Yeah, I remember, it was clear really early on that we were in the midst of an uprising. And I remember in those early days being on the Burnside Bridge that was completely shut down, and, just thousands and thousands of people on the bridge in silence, on the ground, hands behind their back, that just incredibly dramatic stuff playing out before me. And I remember pausing in the midst of all that and looking around and thinking, I might die. We all might die. It's remarkable to look back at that now, but it's true. We really had no data, anecdotal or otherwise. What we were, what could happen as a result of this, both culturally and in terms of impacting legislation and change within policing and throughout the city, but also just in terms of the virus. We just had no idea. And I remember thinking, like, this might be it. I might die. This might be my last assignment. Everyone around me, I don't, it was a real, it stopped me.
Yeah, everyone was taking
you just
that
have to
risk.
keep going with that. I mean, that's weeks or months that we all thought that might be the case.
Right. And I also thought, right after that, I thought, but everyone here is willing to die for this, apparently.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that made
Powerful.
it more.
Go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say the exact same thing. I think that's one of the things that made it so powerful is everybody had to come to that decision. Like, this is more important. It's more important for me to be out here protesting in spite of what that could mean to my health. And many thousands of people made that decision.
How did you view, or how did you sort of strategize documenting, it was like kind of talked about there, the early portions of the nights, which by and large, these nights sort of followed a bit of a pattern, especially early on where things were peaceful.
Hold on.
Oh, you're okay. I wish I had a dog. So jealous right now.
No, you don't. Okay.
I've got two, but they're downstairs.
Okay. Rub it in. Okay. No. How did you both strategize around documenting the early part of the night? You know, there were so many powerful scenes, and then as often as nights progressed, there was destruction and there were instances of violence. And you know, we all journalists know from being out there, there's a large group of people often who were there later in the evenings who did not want to be documented. They didn't want their faces photographed, and they would tell us that, and I'm sure they would tell you that. So how did you sort of, especially if you're there as you were night after night after night after night, and people start to get to know you and they see your work, and if they don't like what you did the night before, you're probably going to hear about it. How did that, how did you sort of develop a strategy around that? And how did you, work within maybe the confines that they would have liked you to have, but you're there to do your job and you're there to document what's happening?
Well, I mean, first of all, the night always played out from start to finish. There was kind of a rhythm to the nights, and often it was very predictable. And often it was, in those early days, largely peaceful. You know, people will argue with that, and but that was a fact. That was true. And so it was really important for us as an organization to reflect the entire night, night after night, and not just sort of go for that, red meat witching hour sort of, police declare a riot and the story pivots from there. So I think that was always really important to us, and still is. You did see a lot of the same faces. Frankly, I saw faces that I recognized from sorry, editing this. I saw faces I recognized from, what was that? Occupy.
Okay.
I saw faces on the, in these protests that I recognized from the Occupy protests of long ago. So, Portland has a rich history of protests. I would say in the intervening years, however, there were circumstances, I think, in St. Louis and perhaps elsewhere where, a protester who had been, widely photographed ended up getting killed. And, there was a reason people had a lot of fear around being photographed. Absolutely. That was a big difference here than in protests past. And of course, then you have people, in the midst of felonious behavior and activities late at night, and they don't want their faces shown. So, it was always tricky for us. I think because, we just we don't wear a lot of branding, or at least we didn't in the early days. But see, that changed because then, we were being assaulted and attacked, and it became clear we needed to identify us, or at least try to distinguish us. Not that it always did any good, but from protesters. It's tricky. I realized very quickly that I was kind of entering a collective, and that there was this sort of pervasive sense that you needed to get permission to photograph someone. And for me, I think that was a big adjustment because we're in the middle of a national and in fact global news story. And we're on public ground, we're have protections under the First Amendment, and it seemed on one level a little absurd, that I would have to try to get everyone's name in a crowd of thousands. But, I realized, I began to understand, where they were coming from. And so I adapted. Yeah, I adapted to that. And I ended up feeling good about it because I think it forced me to kind of connect more. When you're in the midst of thousands of people, it's easy to kind of other it, because there's just so much happening. But when you have to connect with people and make sure they understand what you're doing, who you're representing, where the picture would end up, and you end up in a lot of conversations with people, and it just becomes more intimate and more human. Not that I'm a dehumanizing sort of, that's not what I get into this to be, but it's a challenge, with that many people and under those circumstances. So,
let me really quick, Jay. How are you doing on time? I don't want to. You good? Okay. How are you both doing on time?
Good.
Fine. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Dave. What were you gonna say?
Oh, just I would try, as much as possible to have conversations with people about that aspect of things and sort of explain, like, and I would often say some version of like, listen, I'm not going to make any promises about what I will or won't shoot, but I'm not here to try to get anyone in trouble. We don't share our photos with the police. There's a lot of photos that we take and we don't run. Like, that's a big thing I would try. I shoot thousands every night. That doesn't mean that all of those are going to run. In fact, only a tiny fraction of those are going to run. But yeah, like Beth said, taking, sort of balancing what had become a clear idea amongst a lot of people that we should not shoot certain things with, just because we have the legal right to do it. We also want to consider the ethical ramifications. And then when I would try to have discussions with people, one thing I would often bring up is like I wouldn't grant any promises to the Proud Boys, for example. I mean, you're saying this to a protester in downtown Portland, but if you were to hear that I had told the Proud Boys that I would agree to their terms about how they wanted to be photographed, you probably would not like that, right? And so that's sort of to try to kind of flip it around and be like, I understand where you're coming from, but also think about the reverse sort of, how you would feel about if I were to do exactly what you want me to do, but to, for the benefit of sort of the other side of the spectrum, if you would react to that by thinking, hey, that's not okay, then now you kind of maybe can see why we're at least not going to just blanketly agree to all these restrictions that people would like to have on our coverage. So, it's hard to have those conversations in the field, but a couple of times I feel like I had, good conversations with people that helped both of us understand where the other was coming from.
Gotcha.
It's hard though, Maggie. People, sometimes at the more direct actions and at some of the police sites, and there are people who are committing crimes right in front of me, and it's not my job to protect them. It's my job to show what's happening there and in our city. So it's tricky, very tricky.
Yeah. Sort of like one more question, I guess, on this topic. You mentioned the police, and it's almost like the flip side of that coin, or at least another relationship, so to speak, that you have to take into account when you're out there working. And there were instances of police violence against journalists, and you both mentioned wearing more branding eventually when you were out there. And Beth, I know at least of one instance in particular that definitely got some press when it happened to you. And then Dave, I don't know if anything happened to you that was comparable, but it was definitely a distinct possibility out there in multiple nights, adding in federal officers coming in. Just your thoughts on, had you ever experienced that level? And we've all covered protests in Portland that have where violence has broken out, but had you ever experienced that level, sort of where that was a storyline that permeated over weeks and months, and it was something that people were very concerned about?
Yeah. Well, so what is your question?
So had you ever experienced that before? What was it like to kind of grapple with that element of this, of the protests as well. When you're out there night after night and you are documenting this moment in history, had you ever experienced that before? That kind of level of, I don't want to say aggression from police, but that sort of element of that relationship where it is that contentious and it is maybe that concerning.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out I don't really handle abuse well. I'm not one. I've never been abused, in that way. And it turns out I don't handle it well. I don't think, in fact, anyone should handle it well. So I don't know that it gave me any extra sensitivity to what protesters were going through. I mean, I sort of think in some ways we all went through it together. I think there were moments, Maggie, that were dark, that were more sort of quiet when I could take a moment alone, away from everything. And it was unsettling to think, that I was being assaulted by the state. That was not, that was a sort of a nagging feeling in those darker days, I would say, when the feds were here. And I would just sort of keep it at bay, but that certainly was deeply troubling, which isn't to say it didn't happen with Portland police. It certainly did. It happened with me more than once, and it happened with you, Dave, worse than me, although I got more of the publicity maybe because I'm female, or it happened early on with me. But yours was...
I just hate I just hate attention, so I keep... Yeah.
This whole thing must be excruciating.
No, I didn't want the attention.
No. Beth, you just got... just trying to... No, well, like Maggie, you were saying, so for years, all of us have had, sort of get pushed around or caught, a few pepper balls or whatever. That's all pretty standard protest stuff. But yeah, I think, again, like Beth said, not to say that the Portland police never have done anything like this. And I think that was a Portland police officer who hit you, Beth, right? That was before, yeah. But when the federal officers were here, it really was ratcheted up. I mean, not even to take into account the just massive amounts of gas that we all were dealing with, on a nightly basis, just tons of gas. But and like I said, the pepper balls are sort of a pretty kind of old hat kind of thing, but those 40 millimeter rubber or foam bullets, I'd never been shot with one of those before, and I ended up getting shot by one of the federal officers from pretty close range, like maybe 20 feet away, with one of those. People call them rubber bullets, but I think they're actually foam tipped. But and it felt like there was no way the guy was not aiming for me, and there was no way he didn't know that I was pressed. And that was a whole order of magnitude different than a rubber bullet. I mean, that was very striking. And, it was able to sort of bounce back up and get back to work. But it was very, for a moment, it knocked me down. It was looking for the right word here. It was very painful. I knew what it was. I knew I hadn't actually been shot, but it was definitely I couldn't just shrug it off. I fell to the ground and kind of had to collect myself and get back up. And then once I reported back to the office what had happened, they ended my night. And I have a scar from it on my stomach, on my left side. And then I ended up getting shot with one of those later on by the Portland police in an incident that I feel was less targeted because it was through a haze of smoke, and it was more of a glancing blow. But yeah, that first one, it really felt intentional and unnecessary.
Right, and I get the baton very early on, and then later when the feds were here, sometime it's very much a blur, but sometime around that same time you got more seriously injured. I would say I got hit with canisters on my knee.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
And we documented our bruises and our attacks. But yeah, it was a dark time. And, I really understand now more, I would say more than I ever did. I used to think, why would a little slap or something or a little tap be considered assault? And now I understand that violating physical boundaries is a really powerful thing, and yeah, should not be tolerated. And I understand why it's so serious, even when it doesn't seem that way. So.
One more question about the protests. Dave, you took the naked Athena photo, and that blew up pretty quickly. I mean, do you remember that? I mean, for people who remember that photo, do you remember that moment, and were you surprised that it sort of struck the chord that it did?
Yeah, it was. I almost did nothing with that photo, to be honest. Because frankly, I was concerned about how it didn't really feel like. I wasn't so concerned about the nudity, but I was concerned that it was not all that relevant. Frankly, like that was a big night of a lot of police response. It was when the federal officers were in town. That came moments after we'd all been pushed out of the area by the Justice Center with a massive amount of tear gas and just a huge police response. And that felt like the story of the night. And I was still, wiping my eyes and trying to get kind of my gear together and get collected after this big push that all the officers had made when she appeared. And it was a long night. It was, again, I was still kind of recovering from the tear gas, and I'd also been pepper sprayed. Right, so I was just kind of a mess. My initial reaction was, I don't know. First of all, I didn't know who she was. I didn't know her state of mind. There were only the people who had ended up in that area. There were only male photographers. It was me and a handful of others. I felt a little weird about that, clustering around this extremely vulnerable naked woman. So I was very conservative with. I only took a handful of frames. I kind of got out in the street, took a few shots, and then the one that became well known is one of I just briefly knelt down, got a few shots from that angle, which seemed like a good angle. Sort of encompass the whole scene, and it's the only frame where I'm not blocked by someone walking in front of me or something. So I really only had the one shot, and I sent it in. That also happened to be at the end of the night, but I sent it in with all of our editors are probably not paying attention to this part of the night, so I knew I didn't want it to just get posted. And I didn't use it on Twitter or anything like that because I just, for all of those reasons, I didn't feel it was necessarily an accurate reflection of the news of the night. I didn't know how we would feel about the nudity. There were just a lot of reasons I wasn't comfortable using it right away, so I didn't. And we weren't going to use it at all. Just from the paper, there was, we talked about the next day. The only way we're going to do anything with it was if it became a bigger story, like she became a bigger story, and through sort of a minor faux pas of mine, where I put that photo in a set of photos on my private Facebook page, just like here's what last night was like, and I put it at the very end. I was trying to make it, minimize it as much as I could, but I forgot that I was Facebook friends with a guy I used to work with who now works for the LA Times. He saw it, got a hold of our bosses, asked if he could do a story on it, if they could crop it, all this stuff, and then sort of like the cat was out of the bag. And I remember sometime in there I had talked to you, Beth, and I was like, yeah, I don't know if this photo's any good. And you were like, it's a striking picture or something. But yeah, I kind of
aware of being a male photographer in a situation, and she being sort of the physical manifestation of vulnerability. And yet, for much of the time, being surrounded by these guys with cameras,
Yeah, it's very like male gazy, like literally. And nothing against anyone else. I'm friends with most of those other photographers, and not disparaging them at all. I just hesitant. So really,
Careful.
so nothing happened with it for a few days, and then the LA Times did their story in it, and it took off. And I learned what it's like to be glued to Twitter for 2 straight days because.
I'm sorry, that part.
And I know, like, a lot of people really don't like that photo. I mean, there's a lot of, understandably, people read her as being a white woman who, we don't know her ethnicity, but that's the way people read the photo and see it as appropriation, which, I can certainly understand that. And I don't think she likes the photo. If we've never talked to her. I know from what I understand, she wants to remain anonymous, but there was a podcast that ostensibly it's her, and I don't see any reason not to believe that it's her on this podcast, and she does not like the photo or at least what it represents. So.
Okay. So then fast forward to, I promise we're coming to the end, but the wildfires, it's like August into September. Just as journalists, like, how is your mental health at the time? Because I just remember all of us kind of realizing, like, here comes another massive story that will last for weeks, if not months. What do you remember about that time?
I remember the wildfires as being actually a personal, as close to a breaking point as I've ever arrived at. It seemed like this sort of like grand and catastrophic, like biblical gesture at that point, and we were already so overwhelmed and exhausted with month after month of protest against the backdrop of a global pandemic, and then these catastrophic wildfires. It was sort of, journalists are really resilient people. And so we have that going for us. But I think that was as close to a breaking point in terms of just my own ability to bear it all as I've ever gotten was those wildfires. And then, I went to Springfield, Oregon, and was sort of poking around and looking for things to cover there. There had been a lot of devastation in that area. I found out about an evacuation site behind the Springfield High School, and it was there that I encountered what could only be described as a mirage. Honestly, it was 3 superheroes in the back of the high school playing with children on the track. And so, that was a really pivotal moment for me personally because, I too needed a little hope. These were things that we were. I didn't live anywhere near those fires, but as you know, we had the worst air quality in the world for a while there. So, to the extent that we could experience all of this, we certainly were, and I probably needed those superheroes as much as anyone in that moment. So they were a bit of magic, and they really provided some real enchantment, for children who were playing around there, many of whom I could not photograph, by the way, because there were some privacy issues around some of the kids and their custody stuff, which is kind of a common enough thing we encounter. I always get permission before I start to work when it's little children and that sort of thing. So I didn't photograph too much interaction with children there, but I did capture some. And that, I'm so glad I did. Again, we what we can provide people in those communities, it's kind of an essential link to each other and to information about what's happening. But it's also, in that moment, just a sense of hope where, frankly, there was none. And so I was more than happy to be, the conduit for that and just sort of spread a little joy across the state and actually across the nation. Those photographs kind of spread far and wide and resonated around the country. So it was really nice to be able to provide that.
Yeah, Dave, same question to you. The initial prompt was just like, what do you remember mentally going into that going into that story after everything else this year?
Yeah, I remember Noelle Crombie, a reporter who Beth and I worked with a lot together. She and I drove down to Southern Oregon early on, and what I mostly remember is how hot it was, and because I don't deal well with the heat, and it had been, we went from the protests had gotten pretty hot just because of the time of year, and then obviously the wildfires and the just this sort of exhaustion, like what's next? This is like literally everything is on fire. And I remember something our colleague Brooke Herbert said early on. She's like, this, first we had masks for COVID, then we had masks for tear gas, and now we have masks for wildfire smoke. It's been a year of masks, 2020, and the wildfire smoke, is a different kind of thing. We were trying to. I remember it was so thick driving down I-5. It was almost kind of had to pull over at times. It was like the thickest fog I'd ever driven through. We had the cars, air being recirculation, and I remember Noelle was wearing a mask in the car the whole time to try not to get a headache from the smoke. And I feel like there was a real hopelessness that started to set in. Just felt like the scale of devastation, and people, seeing entire neighborhoods just gone. It was hard to kind of rise to the occasion of being able to just do the job after such an exhausting summer. All like really emotional stories too. The COVID and then the protests and then the wildfires all have that added weight of the, seeing so much suffering. So it was, although it also did, the protests, the wildfires kind of were a natural, not end, but a bit of the nightly aspect of the protest more or less stopped. I think, people were mostly not going to go outside in that horrible air quality. So it was, sort of a sudden and large shift in the main story. And I guess that didn't, from our perspective, it didn't change the sort of overwhelming nature of our jobs, but it was different. So it changed up the routine of every night going out to the protest. You were covering something totally different, and that didn't necessarily make it better or easier, but sometimes having a change in topic at the very least can revitalize you a little bit, I think.
Yeah. The photos since the fires, I was just scrolling through. It's sort of like get into October, and there's sort of like a sweet photo of a kid jumping amidst a Black Lives Matter rally, and then there's a gathering at Terry Shrunk Plaza after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and then it gets into the election, and sort of it almost, in a way, it's a lot of the topics are heavier, but it feels kind of like a bit of a mirror to the photos pre-pandemic. It's like after the wildfires, there's a bit more variety. Some of them are lighter, and I'm just curious, like, sort of both of your thoughts on, that kind of era. It feels like an era, but like the time since the fires and how things have kind of, I don't know if slowed down is the right term, but like based on what you're shooting and what you're covering, what's this sort of come down period been like? For the both of you.
Yeah. Well, I'm on vacation right now. I'm on a little staycation, which is pretty great because I'm doing things that people did because we've done nothing but work all year. So now I'm like, I made my first bread I've ever made in my life. Like I'm doing these pandemic things that all the people were doing when we were so busy working, Nice. And it was great, so I'm having a great time now. I do feel Portland's been through a lot, and I'm not from here, but I've lived here for a long time now. So, it's really different when you live in a community that you also cover. You have a little more of, I would say, it's not like parachuting in, you've got more investment in the community. I know a lot of the people out there on the street and people, working in medicine or being on, in protest, and, this is my community too. And so I am concerned about the city, and where it is at, given everything that's happened, and I want the best for it. So I have to, we have to cover what it is, and not what we wish it were. Okay, but I think within that there's room for hope, and for positive stories, and for reminding us of who we are as a community, beyond the things that were thrust on us, and also to continue, to try to show the work that's happening in the wake of those protests. That and the things that will come out of that, and will continue to come out of that. So we'll still be plenty busy in 2021, but hopefully we'll see some positive change come out of the difficulty. We've got the vaccine coming, and I hope to see businesses get back on their feet, and Portland loves to support Portland. So, I hope we see more of that in 2021. I really just want everyone to be okay. Everyone has been through a lot. And I saw in the protests, over those months, a kind of a collective trauma that just sort of, fell on everybody there. And I see that play out in the chatter, that I see the effects of that still. And so I hope for healing, for people and communities and businesses, and, for Portland to see better days.
Yeah, Dave, same to you. I mean, I guess maybe it's kind of a closing thoughts moment, but just like, what's this come down been like for you after covering this year of really traumatic stories in your own community?
Yeah, it's been an interesting and kind of odd experience adjusting to a less intense time of work. I think we all got kind of addicted to the not adrenaline, but you got used to this really sort of starting work at like 8 p.m. and sort of clock in, go get gassed. It was just a very different lifestyle, and very busy, and felt like we were doing important work, and we still are. But having things slow down recently, it does. I always get a little nervous when I don't feel like I'm not working enough, and so. But I think that's right. There will continue to be, 2021 will, I'm sure, be plenty newsy too. And yeah, I think that obviously one of the biggest stories that remains to be seen is how well the vaccine works, and how quickly they can get it to people. A couple weeks ago shot the first inoculations at Legacy Emmanuel, and that was very it was really encouraging, seeing the healthcare workers and how excited they were, and how it was this culmination of, I remember when the pharmacist brought in the container of the vaccines, and just like the palpable excitement was really great to see. And there's only 15 people were vaccinated that day, but they've been working obviously and waiting and needing this for so long, and it's sort of a window into a light at the end of we don't know how long the tunnel is, but it's seeing the light there. As far as COVID goes, it's obviously encouraging, and so that presumably, I think, coming this year, I don't know. Sorry, that didn't make sense. It seems that a lot of people will be able to get vaccinated this year, and we have a new administration starting up, at the end of this month. I covered a BLM march on what turned out to be the day that the AP called the election for Biden, and a chant that I think just spontaneously started was just because Biden won doesn't mean the work is done. And I thought that, hey, that's a good chant. Just rhyme wise, but that felt like maybe the beginning of a new phase of this social justice movement. And so with all of those things, I'm sure it's going to take a while. Nothing's going to happen instantly in really any form, but as the virus fades away and the Biden administration takes over and starts up, prioritizing what they're going to prioritize, we hopefully will see a lot change from what we saw in 2020. So it'll be interesting to see what we end up covering, and hopefully it's a little easier for all of us.
Okay. I think that's a great place to stop, guys. Anything that I've left out that you think is really worthwhile?
The only thing I would say is, I think I don't know what 2021 will bring, but I suspect there will be some pivot to more activity with the right, and with the not conceding the election, or considering it,
like illegitimate presidency.
Yeah. Considering the presidency to be illegitimate, the election to be a fraud, and unrest on the right. Actually, I suspect we'll see more of that in 2021. But I hope that one day won't bleed into the next the way it did in 2020.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Unfortunately, but I think that's what it's going to be, is more right wing, and with that means probably more that there's just so much more potential for violence. When you go to these things where there's just so many guns. I remember thinking this years ago at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge occupation. There's just so many guns here. All it's going to take is one thing, one person crossing that line, and all hell could break loose. And and I was feeling that way again down a week ago in Salem. Just the addition of firearms, and not that there are never any guns at the more left protests, but it's just an element of potential horror that I feel like, unfortunately, is just kind of sitting there waiting, and one day will blow up into something really bad.